movement actually requires a strong leader. And what Helena was telling us last night about the fact, what does it take for a woman to be seen in that light? The journal that I edit, we did an issue last year on fragility and conflict, looking at the index that attributes a relative measure of fragility going across to the other side of stability to countries. And what came out quite clearly from that issue and from some of the authors writing within it is that it really echoed for me what you said, that quotas may get women into power, but the nature and quality of the governance depends on the relative stability or fragility of a country, in that peace and security don't call on leaders to display traditional male qualities of strength, bravery, and ultimately an ability to impose and coerce people into order. And so peace and security go hand in hand with more women in power. And I thought that idea that there's a virtuous circle between those two things was quite an interesting thing. And for me, what you're saying about the quality of the political system, and in relation to places where you have quotas, but actually it can be quite an authoritarian, really resonated. So thank you very much for providing a new.
And Blair, I think, was a little bit like that. Do you remember the great media package when he was elected in 1997, the New Dawn and all that, included this notion of, unfortunate language, Blair babes. So there were, I think, 118 Blair babes, but in a sense, very few of them rather, got kind of promoted up, and it's taken a completely different struggle, almost after he left, to establish that at least 1/3 of the cabinet ought to be women. I think that's a sort of current thing. I mean, it'll creep up, obviously, but even Mrs. May is not able to quite deliver that. So, absolutely right. There was a survey in Russia of what kind of leader do you want, and it was Christian, 95%. Strong, sort of 91%, white, sort of 90%, and male, sort of 89%. So, this whole notion of the strong leader is, sociologists talk about the sense of order, that one of the things that we want in our society is a sense of order. And so this kind of embedded idea that the sense of order has to be from someone strong, and then strong is linked to male. We've got work to do.
I see 3 hands, let me just count them. There's yourself, and there was anyone in that corner? No. Yourself, Barbara? Yes, of course, yes. So, would you like to start?
Sure. So thank you, Paul. I completely agree that quotas are important in principle, but I wanted to emphasize your point and offer an example from Pakistan. And the point that I wanted to emphasize was your point around, looking at under what conditions quotas have come about and how well female political representatives are actually connected to feminist movements is very important. In Pakistan, the quota was introduced by military dictator Pervez Musharraf, and the female representatives are largely selected along party lines. So even though we perform very well on the UNDP, statistic on 23% of the MPs in Pakistan are female, what we see is that class trumps gender a lot of times, where female MPs have a class-based interest in the preservation of prevailing social and political systems. And also they operate as, like I said, party members and less across parties as a caucus. And most of them have not been involved in the women's movement in Pakistan.
Or even politics.
Or even politics, have no desire to be associated with feminism. And I've been to some really shocking sessions, parliamentary sessions with female MPs, in where their attitudes have been far more sexist and misogynist than male MPs. And also on the Rwandan case, I was listening to a really interesting podcast where it was a journalist who'd interviewed a lot of women MPs, I can find out what the podcast was called, it's slipping my mind, but basically asking them whether that occupying those spaces, those decision-making spaces in political bodies whether that power has translated into decision-making at home. And they largely said that it had not, because it didn't, and one of the reasons they cited was because it didn't emerge out of a feminist movement. That's the struggle, and it was largely sort of the context of there not being men after the Rwandan genocide.
I'm getting this information first time from someone who's doing field work there, who's in my college.
Okay.
I mean, she said that a lot of the women are selected because they fit the stereotype of a woman. In other words, someone who is still home-based and subordinate within the home. And therefore it suits the party hierarchy to have that kind of woman filling the seat, you know. So although it's technically progressive, it's operating in a hugely unprogressive. I mean, the corollary of the other point you make is, of course, it's filling the space which might have been taken by somebody more active and progressive.
That was very interesting, Paul. I just wonder, are there any statistics or research on equivalent quotas in relation to judiciary around the world? In England, there is a burning debate about quotas, and there was a very controversial speech made a couple of years ago by John P. Sumption, one of the Supreme Court judges, arguing very strongly against quotas. Helena mentioned yesterday a project called Targets with Teeth, the idea of which is that you identify a cohort of young female lawyers at an early stage of their careers and try and level the playing field in terms of opportunity to take account of childcare. But I just wonder whether there are any countries in the world where there are quotas for judicial appointment.
I'm not able to answer that, but I mean it's obviously worth looking into. I mean, one could think of quotas in all kinds of different areas and professions. That would be interesting. I mean, I think it's particularly difficult in the law because the law is caught up in this debate about, you know, can you treat people differently? You know, you have to be. I think that argument has been won in the sense that you can treat people differently, particularly, and I like this phrase, it embeds some kind of discrimination. I mean, applying the same law to different people in different circumstances produces different results. And so, you know, having a blanket approach isn't correct. But liberal democracy and legal theory also finds it tricky to give up that principle, you know, and then talks about deserts. You know, do white males deserve to lose out, even if we all agree that there's a kind of benefit? So I think there's a legal philosophy debate, isn't there? I mean, you know better than me.
Well, there's always,
and that makes it tricky in the legal profession.
As with any arena, in the case of quotas, there are always two issues. One is fairness or unfairness to the men and women applying for the job. But the other is the impact on of appointing a particular person to the people who feel the consequences of that job. And in the case, obviously, of judges, not dissimilar from surgeons, there is a natural, very strong opposition to quotas on the ground that when you have a judge, just as when you have a surgeon, you want the best outcome.
Yeah.
And you're not just the fairness to the judge or failed candidate for the appointment is of less importance than the fairness to the people who are going to be on the right or wrong end of a judicial decision.
Two points. One, maybe just following on from this issue. There is the question, you know, what is the right outcome? I was thinking of the example we had earlier of the recent judgment in Quebec, which outraged, I think, people across Canada. So one of the pushes for change in the judicial area is because the kind of judgments that judges in many countries have handed down on issues like domestic violence, like rape, like harassment of women have reflected their own very narrow white male elite rich person perspective on this, and therefore actually you improve the judgments if you have a more diverse bench and you have training for judges in equality. So I think that's part of the argument. Of course, CEDAW has from the beginning had a good position on this. CEDAW has always recognised that you don't get substantively equal outcomes by identical treatment, and I prefer to call it identical than equal, because it's not equal treatment. If some people are already starting off with an unfair advantage because of their class, their race, their gender. And so quotas is allowed by CEDAW under the temporary special measures provision. And I think that thinking of it as temporary special measures also helps us to think of it in terms of behavioural change as a way of changing social norms. So I wanted to link this discussion to the discussion we had earlier this morning about social norms and how to change them. So I think one way is just trying to get pictures of women in politics and the sort of positive media treatment. But